For our next session, we are going to talk about the Booker Prize winning book, The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida, which is also available at our bookstore on 50% discount, so do get a signed copy by Shehan. The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida is a thrilling satire that has been making a lot of noise this year. The book has a captivating premise. A photographer dies and has 7 moons to discover how he died. I cannot share yet what discovery the photographer makes yet, but what we will soon know is what discoveries Shehan made while writing the book. We have had the honor of already having 2 sessions with Shehan, and if you weren't present during those sessions, do watch them when the recording is available. Shehan Karunatilaka has published 2 novels and 3 children's books, including Chinaman, The Legend of Pradeep Matthew, winner of the 2012 Commonwealth Book Prize, and The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida, winner of the 2022 Booker Prize. In addition, he has also written features on sport, music, and travel for The Guardian, National Geographic, and elsewhere. Siwani Singh Tharu is the former television host of the popular show Mero Geet Mero Sandesh and the author of a serious work of fiction, Katmanuma Ek Din. She has worked for BBC Media Action as a producer and director of radio dramas like Kotha Mito Saraniko and Kotha Mala. Let's put our hands together for Siwani and Shehan.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Finally, the wait is over. I'm here with Shehan and I'm very excited. And I'm rather very nervous, only in one way, because I've got a lot of questions and we don't have a lot of time. I can go on about 2 hours, but we only have, let's say, 45 minutes, because 15 minutes we have to open up for the audience. So hello Shehan, welcome to 10th edition of the Nepal Literature Festival.
Thank you for having me. Merry Christmas everyone, and yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Is this your first trip to Nepal?
Yes, it is.
How are you finding it?
Oh, I'm loving it, and got a few more days here, and yeah, enjoying
You'll be staying in
the scenery.
Kathmandu? You'll be staying in Kathmandu also?
Hopefully a day in Kathmandu as well, but there's enough to see in Pokhara, so.
Yeah. And yes, of course, congratulations for the Booker Prize for your second book, The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida.
Thank you very much.
Your ears must be ringing with congratulations. Anyway,
That's fine. My emails are clogged and my text messages and all that, but no, it never gets old. I appreciate the love.
Okay, you won DSC Prize and Commonwealth Book Prize for your first novel, and then you won Gratian Prize also for your unpublished novels, unpublished work. Is it true?
Yeah, so that was all for the first book, Chinaman, The Legend of Pradeep Matthew.
No, not the Gratian Prize.
Yeah, so that was the manuscript. That was the first version. So it seems that I write multiple versions of the same book. I'm doomed to do that. But yeah, that was...
And now you've won Booker Prize. Now, I was thinking you must be feeling like Meryl Streep of Sri Lankan literary world.
No, there are a lot of prizes that I haven't got as well. And yeah, in 15 years, I published 2 books and they've managed to win some prizes, but...
every time you write a novel, you seem to get prized.
Well, I've also I wrote Chats with the Dead, the previous version of that, which came out, and it may seem that way. My batting average is not bad, 2 books, and, yeah, let's see. You can't expect to roll a 6 every time, so I think my next book, I don't know what maybe it has to win an Oscar to top this or something, but yeah, I think the pursuit of prizes is, we can talk about that later, but yeah, I have been quite lucky. Yeah.
No, your work is very wonderful, not just lucky. So I was wondering, like, when you get a lot of prizes like this, I mean, of course it has a positive part also, but in a way, does it pressures or weighs you down while writing another novel, stories? Does it weighs you down, like, to think in a certain way, to write in a certain way, and especially to choose the subject matter so that it appeals to wider audience, like worldwide? Does it weighs you down sometimes?
The pressure is always there. I've never escaped it. Even writing an email, I get anxiety. Even writing a tweet, I get... So the pressure of... And I write for a living, so I work as a copywriter, I write features, kids' books, and so on. And so the pressure is always there. You know, am I able to tell this properly? Is anyone going to read it? So that's, and you got to bear in mind, my first book came out in 2011, 2012,
Yeah.
and so it's been a long, and it's been 10 years of people asking me, when's your next book out, when's your next book out? And I think the thing you got to do is you got to silence all the voices, and when you're writing, you have to forget about who's going to review it, who's going to read it, and you're just going to, you got to get to a place where it's just you and the story and these invisible characters and the voices. And I think the pressure will always be there, regardless of whether it won or not. The third book is not going to write itself. It still has to be done. And it's best not to think of these things. I think that if you start thinking about wider audiences, usually I just write for a reader like me or someone who has had similar experiences, and that's all you're thinking of. I think if you start thinking too widely, you're going to be crippled, and it's going to be difficult. So, yeah.
So, especially, like, I was watching your interviews with the journalists, and in one interview you said, like, after writing Chinaman, you met Saurav Ganguly in India, and then he was asking you, like, what about the cricket in India? And then you said, no, I can't be just a cricket man. I have to write ghost stories. Now, you've written this book and also won the award, Booker Prize. Do you think people are now asking you about the Sri Lankan Civil War, Ilam War, JVP War, Indian Peacekeeping Force, and all that?
So this is the problem. So I wrote the cricket book. I mean, I'm a moderate Sri Lankan cricket fan. I mean, and I was in my 20s when we won the World Cup. So that I was part of that, the golden generation of Sri Lankan cricket I followed. But yeah, it was getting a bit weary because I spent 2 years just watching cricket and hanging out with drunk old men and writing that. But when I was finished, I was done. But I got invited to a lot of cricket panels. And yeah, this one with Saurav Ganguly, I remember people were asking me, do you think Kumar and Mahela don't get on? Is that why Sri Lanka didn't win the World Cup? Do you think the World Cup was fixed? And this is beyond my knowledge. And so, yeah, that was my motivation for writing this. I thought, you write a ghost story, I'm never going to get another cricket assignment.
And the same trail of questions are hounding you again about the Sri Lankan.
But now, yeah, now I'm getting asked about gruesome murders and things like that. So I think my next book is going to be a harmless little comedy. And so I think that's the thing. Once you're done with a book, I mean, some writers write the same genre, write the same book over and over again. I mean, it could be argued that we all write the same book in one way or the other. But yeah, I'm looking forward to writing something lighter so I don't get asked about difficult history. But you know, these are small prices to pay. The book's popular and it's good that people are talking about it. Yeah.
So before we discuss the book extensively, I would like to request you to give just very briefly one line of The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida, because of course, most of us have already read it, but few who have not, it will be easier for them to put it into context.
One line?
Not one line, one line story, I said. One line story, just a briefly.
You mean to summarize it?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Sure. I don't know if I can do it in one line, but I'll try.
One line story.
So at its heart, it's a murder mystery. It's a guy, a dead guy, he's got 7 days to solve his murder. So I think that's the engine that runs through it. But also there's many layers to it. So he's also a war photographer who happened to, and it's set during 1989, and we can talk about that year as well, where there were multiple factions in Sri Lanka's civil war, in its Marxist uprising, the Indian Peacekeeping Force, you mentioned some of them, and he was working for all of them. So in a murder mystery, that's the convention. You have 5 or 6 suspects who might have wanted them dead. So that's the heart of it, but also because he was a war photographer, he had this cache of photographs, this box under his bed of photographs that no one has seen of Sri Lanka's wars. And so there's a political thriller element to it. But also, it's a ghost story, there's a vision of the afterlife, there's a lot of ghostly philosophizing, there's a love triangle at the center of it. And yeah, a few jokes as well. And so there's a lot of moving parts to it. But at the heart of it, I think it's a murder mystery of this guy uncovering why he was killed, but also uncovering painful truths about Sri Lanka.
And it's set in the background of 89 to 90 year. So it's
That's right.
Basically it's about the era of 80s when Sri Lankan war was raging in north and east. So you know, when you gave the day before yesterday, when you were giving speech that find the story that only you can write, that was very inspiring. And in that speech, you said, at first, when your book, when it was published as Chats with the Dead had come, there were no more reviews, like people would not review your books. And now, since it has republished as The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida, there are lots and lots, and maybe more than 20, 30 video blogs in YouTube about the book. So it was very overwhelming for me to go each and every review, but I was, you know, wondering if Shehan has gone each and every review of that book, of that videos. Have you seen all of them?
No, none. So I haven't even watched now. The speech I gave at the book, it's been shared a lot.
Yes.
I haven't watched it even once. I can't.
Really?
No. I started and I was like, oh no. You know, I was there. I partially remember what happened, and I'm happy with that memory of it. And also now, I mean, it's a lie to say I don't read anything, but we're told don't read the comment section of anything, and I think that's good advice. And yeah, initially I know there's been a positive kind of response to it, but you know, there's also been trolls and people who've had negative response, and I think the book's done. It's not like I'm going to have to write it again. I hope.
Do you read the trolls or not? Trolls? Do you read the trolls and comments?
I try not to. I mean, it's a bad habit. Yeah. I'm aware people send me the stuff and all that, but I think the book's done now, and it's none of your business what people think about it, and there's nothing you can do.
Yes.
You might as well move on to the next one.
So at that stage, I had not actually finished my book reading. So, you know, I was watching all the interviews that you had given to the journalist. So I was thinking, like, people have already asked a lot of questions about the book in a different angle. And by the time Shehan comes to Nepal and I ask him the question, he will probably vomit over my question, answering the same question in different way. But then I finished the book and I have a different set of questions. That shows the beauty of your book. And it has many layers. So I'm going to ask you, first thing first. You know, the first line of The 7 Moons goes like this. You wake up with the answer to the question that everyone asks. It is deceptively very simple line, yet very memorable line. How did you, I mean, how many days it took you to write that simple line? It sounds like simple, but it is not. So how many days it took you, if not weeks?
Weeks? No. Years. So the beginning I've rewritten more times than I can remember, as with the ending. So my editor, Natanya Jans, who took Chats with the Dead, and over the pandemic we tinkered with it, performed surgery on it. The beginning was the most problematic because I wanted to introduce the idea that you wake up and you're confused, and so convey that confusion, but also it's a fine line. You also confuse the reader and you turn off the reader. So yeah, I don't know about that particular line, but I know the beginning was that whole episode in the passport office or in the afterlife office where he finds out what he has to do. That was rewritten many, many times.
And especially I like the first, you know, first I liked it when I read it for the first time. And then after the climax, I loved it because you used it again in the past tense. So I thought it was a very clever way of doing it. So did that idea came about when you were writing and it came about in a light bulb moment, or you were writing and that came along, the idea of using the same line in a different context, but with the present tense and past tense?
Yeah, so I think these all happen in rewriting because I knew the premise was interesting, but I didn't know where it was going to end up. But also, if you notice, there are subtle things. So when Maali is remembering his past, it's in the past tense. And when he's the you that's narrating what's happening after death, it's in the present tense.
Yeah.
And that moment where the two stories catch up with each other, it shifts to say that, yeah, he's now back at the start. And so I think that was also the use of the second person voice. The second person narrating the story and the Maali who's remembering are slightly different. They are not their tone is different, and it's almost like the Maali who went through all of this is a different person to the one in the afterlife. So this is stuff that, you know, you each time you go over it, and I went over it many, like, you think it's done, and then it comes back, and she says, well, I think the middle doesn't quite work and the endings doesn't land and the beginning's boring. But other than that, it's terrific. But can we spend another couple of months on this? And so I think with each of these, and but also I work in advertising, so I'm used to clients changing copy. That's part of life. You know, you think you've nailed it and you send it out and yeah, it comes back with all these red marks. So once you get over your initial sort of disillusionment and you do it, you realize it keeps getting better. So these subtle things, there was no, I mean, light bulb moments are very few. I mean, I wrote this over 7 years. Maybe a few characters might emerge, but mainly it's hard slog.
No, the reason I'm asking this question is because, when Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote 100 Years of Solitude, and then the first line is very iconic. We all know that many years later, and the line goes, and yeah. And that first line came while he was driving, and I thought it was very wonderful. I mean, maybe, you might have that kind of story, so that's why I asked you that question.
Okay, no, so it doesn't, I know John Irving apparently has the last line. Before he starts a book, he has the last line.
Okay.
And he then writes up to the last line.
That's interesting.
And I mean, you don't know if these stories are true, but what he says is, very rarely in his entire career has that last line changed. He starts with the last line and then he moves forward. For me, it doesn't work. It comes to me in images. So this image about this dead guy opening their eyes and seeing this confusion, that image, the image of a talking leopard being the most wisest character in the book, these are just like images that came to me and I write around it. Seldom that you have lines that trigger things, but it comes to you in different ways. I've had short stories where a line leads to greater things, but I revise so many times that this is why I don't tweet, because each time I write the tweet and then I revise it so many times, it's like 3 months later and the story is no longer in the news. So I am a rewriter.
Me too. Before we talk about the characters of the novel, I want to talk about the setting of the novel. I know it's been asked so many times, but I still want to ask you. So it is set in the year 1889 and 90s, when Sri Lankan war was at the peak in the north and the east, and then the JVP in the south. At that time, you grew up in Colombo. At that time, how was your life in Colombo?
So I was a teenager at that time, and also I was insulated because in Colombo, we had schools closing down, we had curfews. Occasionally, there'll be a bomb blast or assassination. But we mostly, and you're seeing it even today, carried on as if the war was happening in another country almost. But people who grew up in the north and the east had obviously a much more horrific experience. And for instance, my wife's family was in the hill country, in the plantations at the time, and so her experience of the JVP troubles was much more brutal. But for me, there was that element that I did see bodies on the road, bodies burning in tires. That was normalized. And the thing is, you didn't know why they were killed or who killed them, because there could have been multiple things, multiple perpetrators and multiple motives. But I don't think and I talk about in the book this idea of the Colombo bubble, the Colombo bubble being separate from the rest of the country. And you see it now, even in the economic crisis. The country is being pushed into poverty, even though things are stabilized now. But you go to Colombo now, it's partying for Christmas, and the lights are on, and people are spending. So that guilt, I guess, stayed with me. And later, later I made friends with people who grew up in the north and the east, and who were part of the JVP, were part of the LTT, were part of the government, the army, and spoke to them and catalogued all their experiences. But also this period was well written about, well researched, so I could lean on that.
Did you actually go to Jaffna?
I did go to Jaffna like right after the war. I think that was the first time. So I grew up in Sri Lanka it wasn't until my 30s that I visited places like Trincomalee, Batticaloa, and Jaffna. Those places were off limits for us.
But while you were writing this book, did you actually go there?
I did a lot of road trips. I visited like haunted houses all over Sri Lanka. Wherever there were ghost stories, especially in the tsunami-ravaged coast, I went there.
Haunted house?
haunted houses, a lot of haunted plantation bungalows. I haven't seen a ghost yet, and I don't particularly want to see one. But I went to these places. Some people see, some people don't. And yeah, my friends were with me. I mean, it was a hell of a road trip. I didn't use much of it, if I'm being honest. I took a lot of photos because in the end, the story ended up just being in Colombo in a very small geography. But no, I didn't encounter any ghosts. But yeah, I went to Jaffna right after the end of the war, and it was what an eye-opening place that was. And I haven't visited recently. But the fact that we were in Colombo and this whole part of the country was off limits to us, that informed my experience. And if you look at Maali Almeida, he also talks about that guilt of being a privileged middle-class guy in Colombo while these terrible things are happening elsewhere. And unlike me, I mean, I was a teenager, I went back to playing video games and watching movies and watching cricket. He actually went to those places and photographed them. So I think there was that element, and he talks about it as well. How can we live our lives while the rest of our country is suffering? But answer to your question is, I didn't see much apart from a few dead bodies, and my experience is like quite mild compared to most people who lived during that era.
So why did you choose to tell the story on that backdrop of 89 and 90? What was the reason?
Well, I remember it, and I remember seeing the fear on my parents' faces during that time, and I was always curious about that period, but also it was a wider idea. My idea for this story was, what if Sri Lanka's dead could speak? Because the living are debating about how many died, whose fault it was, whether we should even talk about it. And I felt, okay, if the victims of Sri Lanka's wars were allowed to speak in a ghost story, that could be quite interesting. And there were plenty of periods I could have chosen from. The obvious would have been 2009, the end of the war, the final phase, and the number varies from 20,000 to 40,000.
4,000 people died.
How many?
40,000 people died.
So the number, initially we were told 0 civilians died, and that they couldn't peddle that for a while. Then
that also in no fire zone area. That also in no fire zone area.
So far as what? Sorry?
No fire zone.
No fire zone.
Everything is echoing over here, that's why.
Yeah. So that idea of the cage, and I remember this battle of the documentaries that happened 2010, 2011. The Channel 4 had the killing fields of Sri Lanka. The government had a counter documentary. And I was watching this going, you're arguing over the wrong things. We should be looking at the causes of the war and how we move forward, but still they're bickering over whose fault it is and whether we can even mention the number of how many people died. So that was the idea, but I thought, look, writing about this, even talking about this now is controversial. You know, the end of the war, it's like, why are we bringing that stuff up? It's bygones. So I thought, why don't I go to the most terrible period that I remembered, which was 89, 90, where there was a civil war, there was a Marxist insurrection, and a foreign army on the soil, and various, arms dealers and foreign agencies running around. So this is great for a murder mystery. And basically, I'm not a political writer. I think I'm a genre writer. My first book was a detective story. This is a murder mystery. And so I was just collecting all these suspects. So that's the reason I decided to write about it. I didn't intend for it to be a big political statement on the state of Sri Lanka. I thought it would just be a murder mystery set in our past. I thought I was writing historical fiction. But for whatever reason, fortune or misfortune, it came out in 2022 when Sri Lanka was imploding again. So everyone sort of draws parallels between that. Yeah.
So this book was initially published as Chats with the Dead. How was it received initially?
So it came out just before the pandemic, January, February 2020. And I was just relieved to have a second book done because you've written one book, you're not sure if you can do another one, and it took a good 10 years before the publication. So it came out, and it was reviewed well in India, and I think it was published in the subcontinent.
And in Sri Lanka, how was it taken?
I don't know how widely read it was, in the sense we were then preoccupied with everyone went indoors and for 2 years, and meanwhile, all I noticed is that I couldn't find a publisher outside of the subcontinent, and so I was engaged with rewriting this book again. And now, of course, with the Booker, it's been selling quite well in Sri Lanka, judging by all the Christmas copies I've had to sign over the last month. But let's see the reaction. I think people have been commenting before they've read it based on the hype of the prize. I think now, once people have read it, we'll have a discourse about it. But answer your question, I don't think if you're looking for, was it received controversially? I don't think so. I think it was seen then as just a ghost story of the past. I think now it's taken on a new meaning because of the attention and because of it coming out in this period. Yeah.
Okay, so when you were writing this book, were you cautious at the back of your mind of not ruffling feathers of people who do not want to talk about or hear about war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in civil war? Were you cautious, or you were not cautious at all and you just wrote it from your guts?
Yeah, I should have been more cautious if I knew it'll get this much attention. I was more cautious with my first book. So my first book was about cricketers and match fixers and so on. And I asked a lawyer, am I going to get sued? Because I would like, my cricketers weren't very well disguised, you know, Hashan, Mahanama, Arjuna, De Silva, they were like names like that. And so I was wondering, will this get me into trouble? The lawyer said, look, if you get sued by a famous cricketer, that'll be great for book sales, so let's hope that happens. Of course, this is very different subject matter. I didn't feel brave doing it because everyone was dead. The president at the time, the Indian president had been assassinated, the Sri Lankan president had been assassinated, the perpetrators were dead. The JVP still exists, but in a very different, now they are a mainstream political party. So I felt that, what feathers are there to ruffle, because this is now many, many governments ago, many, many catastrophes ago. So I didn't think too much about it. The other thing I should have really thought about is writing from the point of view of a homosexual man. Again, there are questions of appropriation. Do we have permission to do those things? But at the time, no. This was 2013, 14, 15. So that debate, I was just interested in what would if there was a character, and there were characters who photographed. I was speaking with William Dalrymple, if I may name drop, and he did a review, and he said, I was there in '89 as a photographer, and I saw a lot of these things you did. So people were there, and I was more interested in that story. You don't expect feathers to be ruffled when you're writing, literary fiction, murder mysteries set in Colombo. So I wasn't. So maybe I should have been a bit more cautious. But
because
yeah.
The reason I'm asking you this question is because while I was researching about this book and about you, I came across one website. It's called Lankan Web, and then there a number of people have reviewed your book, and then what they've done is extracted lines and sentences, and which is basically Maali talking very furiously about the politics of war, racial identity, and poking fun at flags. So, and at the end of the book review, what they have concluded is basically Shehan is writing in the interest of white people and in the cost of national shame. So I was kind of a little bit afraid for you. That's why I was asking this question. So you were not cautious at all?
Well, now you've made me worried. I don't know. I thought it was fine. Okay, a couple of things. First is confusing Maali Almeida with me is, I think, a schoolboy error. I think I wrote about a 64-year-old drunk, and I have occasional drink, but I don't think anyone accused me for being a 64-year-old alcoholic. And this is a radical guy. He was doing some very dangerous things, and he had been to the battlefield and seen some heinous crimes. And so he was angry and quite outspoken about his contempt for what Sri Lanka had become and the values that our society was built on and who the country belongs to and who has a right to talk and who doesn't. And so he talks about this. And yeah, he talks about the flag. He questions the idea, why do we have an animal with a sword pointed at the minorities in our flag? What is that supposed to represent? And but and also when you're writing for so many years, you're in the characters. This is not stuff that I would publish in a blog or I would tweet about. But when you're hiding behind a fictional character, you get braver. With the reviews, I think there is that tendency when, and this is the central thing about the book. I think that if you sum up the central theme is, what do we do with our past? Do we bury it, which is what seems to be the national policy, we bury it and we forget about it, or do we dig it up and look at it and look at all the dirt and the ugliness and talk about it? And that's what Maali's photographs represent. This is a way of actually, because the war now seems an abstract concept. There's a few photographs online and stuff, but it fades from memory, especially for generations who were born afterwards. And so Maali figures that these photographs being seen, this will end everything. Quite naively, he thinks that. So I think that debate still rages, and it rages in the book as well. He's got these two characters, Dr. Rani and Sena Patirana. One is a Marxist activist, one is a slain moderate. And they both give him, one of them saying, just forget about the past, forget about your life, just walk into the light and forget. And the other one saying, that's exactly what they want you to do. You need to go back and address the injustices. And I think this debate still rages in Sri Lanka. If we look back at something quite recent, like the Easter attacks, many narratives around that horrible event. But it seems like 2019 is almost ancient history now. We're like, okay, no, we've got to worry about an economic crisis and 2022, and yeah, whatever happened, it was tragic, but let's move on. So that was really the central theme of this, and that's what Maali grapples with as well.
You are taking it very, I mean, you are saying like, you do not feel very, very courageous to tell all these things. It came very naturally to you. But I was kind of a little bit afraid for you, and then that's why I have next question a little bit regarding that, because Salman Rushdie, your favorite writer, he was attacked in August. So what was your initial reaction as a writer? Were you nervous? Were you intimidated? Were you angry? You were worried?
Yeah, so we've lived with Sir Salman's fatwa, we've lived with it all, and we've seen that. And I think as South Asian writers, we don't take freedom of speech for granted. Because we know, and I've lived in periods where speaking out is quite a dangerous thing. Whether you're a journalist or just independent commentator, speaking out is a dangerous thing. So you are cautious about what you talk about. And this tendency to also say that, and a lot of Sri Lankan filmmakers who win awards at Cannes or something, depicting the war, get this criticism. You know, you're showing Sri Lanka as a killing field, which it was in the past, and you're selling this. It's not, but the thing is this, even though I'm writing books about talking animals and demons, this stuff is not stuff I made up. These atrocities happen, so if you think it's national shame, it is national shame that these things happen, but I don't think talking about it should be national shame. I think talking about criticizing your country, and I think he says it, criticizing your country is not an act of treason, it's an act of love. It's because you are disappointed by what has happened.
Very well said.
And so that's been my policy. But and to be fair, this is a minority who feel that, and who perhaps have not read it or have read it too closely, who feel that if you're talking about the atrocities of the past, you know, that's bringing them up and you're stirring up the trouble again. But I think the opposite. I think if you're talking about things, you're ensuring that we understand them and that they never happen again, which is what every Sri Lankan should be hoping, and I think does hope for.
7 Moons of Maali Almeida is a magical realism, and we know, be it Marquez writing 100 Years of Solitude, or Isabella Allende writing The House of Spirit, or Salman Rushdie writing The Midnight's Children. So all these 3 iconic books are written on the backdrop of the troubled history of the country. So and also in your case, so I want to ask you, what is, in your opinion, why do writers prefer to use magical realism as a genre, or let's say tool, to tell the story on that background where you are very uncomfortable, or let's say, which is, you know, the past of the country is very troubled? Why do you think magical realism is a preferred tool?
So I didn't set out to write magical realism. I thought I was writing a very realistic ghost story, and I was documenting the afterlife as a journalist. And
it happened to be magical realism.
Yeah, so also this term, because what is magic realism, what is fantasy? If there's a dragon in your book, is it fantasy or is it magic realism? I guess if the dragon is a Marxist, then it's magic realism. If the dragon's just a fire-breathing creature, it's fantasy. And I often wondered this, and I suppose if it gets classified as magic realism, it gets put for literary prizes. If not, HBO makes a series. So I don't know which I would have preferred. But I wasn't thinking.
But in your opinion, was it a conscious decision to, to write it in a magical realism genre?
So I think I like genre fiction, perhaps more than literary fiction, and I like the ghost story. And so that was where I started out. Okay, if you're telling a ghost story from the point of view of the ghost, you have to invent things that are not perhaps scientific. You have to invent a whole mythology of the afterlife and then talking animals and demons and hungry ghosts and all of that. So I was caught up in too much in that world to think about what am I actually doing here. But I think, to your question, it's there are a lot of very realistic books written about Sri Lanka's conflict. So Aruk Pragasam, who was shortlisted last year, he's writing about the same war, but in a very, very different mode. And his books are quite meditative, but very realistic. You don't get talking animals in his books, but and there's a lot of writers who write very almost reportage versions of Sri Lanka's tragedies. For me, I think, and I've tried that, but I guess I'm mostly attracted to absurdity. And there's a lot of absurdity in Sri Lanka, whether you look at 89 or you look at today or...
Recent.
Yeah, recent. I mean, a whole population rose against a very heavily armed state. It could have ended up in a massacre. But how did it end up? With guys jumping in the president's pool, with guys sitting on the president's couch watching the president's TV, and we saw all of that. And so this absurdity also goes in hand with, and even though we've had a very terrifying, uncertain year, the jokes have never stopped coming. The
memes and
the memes and all of that. So I think maybe this is also my sensibility that if I wrote a realistic depiction of 89, it'll probably be a very, very depressing book. And if you go and you research 1989, the truth is far more gruesome than this book. And I have scenes where bodies are fed to cats or hinted at. Or that was one thing that was taken out from Chats with the Dead. We had a scene where bodies were fed to cats. And in this one, we only kind of hint at it. But I'm saying that the real story, the reality is far more gruesome than this. So I think this is maybe a mechanism that, and I wasn't, you don't think of yourself in the same tradition as the names you, Isabel Allende and Rushdie and Marquez. Why would you think that? I wrote one book about cricket and drunks. I'm not in that pantheon. But yeah, I think I was just interested in the ghost story and wrote it that way. But also the absurdity and the dark humor of being in this predicament, that wasn't lost on me. And maybe that made it more easier for me to write and perhaps easier to read. If I'd left out the absurdity and the magic elements, I don't know, it certainly would have been a different book and a different reading experience.
Well, as a South Asian, when you read it, that ghost part reads like a very folkloric story, and realism is there. But when it comes down to Western world, they definitely categorize it as a magical realism. So that's why I was asking. But you have answered my second question also, because I was going to ask you. You've written this novel in a black humorish way. So I was going to ask you that, in our country also we had this 10 years of Maoist insurgency, and in your country's case it was like 25 years of Ilam wars. So over here also, we are like, the fatigue has settled in, where we don't want to read about another war story or write about another war story. So I don't know about Sri Lanka, but if it is that case, like if that fatigue has settled in, that they don't want to read about another war story, depressing story. So that's why you added that black humorish tone to it, or it just Shehan Karunatilaka's wonderful sense of humor?
I think it's the narrators that I choose. Maybe I'm attracted to this type of character because the first book is about an old man drinking himself to death. And the only thing he can think of any worth in his life was a cricketer he saw in 1987. And now this is quite a depressing story, but I don't think Chinaman is a depressing book because of the narrator, the way he sees life and the way he doesn't believe he's wasted his life. He thinks, I could have got involved in politics or wars. Instead, I watched cricket and drank arak and watched this nothing country become a world champion. I think, wow, what better way to spend a life? So that I was writing through his lens, and yeah, these are funny guys. Maali's not as funny as WG, but he does see the absurdity and the craziness in it. So I think it was his voice as well. Why is he you know, he's quite a promiscuous guy, he's a gambler, he's also a very good photographer, and he's dealing with these dodgy characters, but he also sees even these arms dealers and all that. You see, they're horrific characters. The body disposers, the cops, the corrupt cops, they're all horrific characters, but there's some sort of zaniness to, especially to their nicknames and so on. But also, just one more point about humor. I think it's true that Sri Lankans like to smile and we're quite happy-go-lucky, and we say resilient in the face of, we always like to make jokes and all that. But I think humor is also, it's quite a weapon, because over the last year, they chased out a government, or at least a president, who they feared. We feared 10 years ago you would not speak out about the president because journalists were being killed in broad daylight and disappeared and so on. Whereas 10 years ago, something had shifted, that we were going through economic crisis, and maybe it was the influence of the internet, maybe we'd had 5 years of freedom of expression, free press, but people were emboldened to mock these dictators and the ruling parties. And I think the act of mocking them on the streets, on the internet, that sort of robs the dictator of their power. So I think humor, rather than, there were a few scary incidents, but it was a largely peaceful protest. And I think maybe humor helps, and maybe we realized you either laugh at the thing or you commit terrible acts of violence, and it's less messy to laugh at a thing than to do that.
Sure. So let's talk about character now. Your main protagonist is a ghost of Maali Almeida. But we know that you do not believe in ghosts. You don't intend to meet any ghost, and you've actually...
Well, I haven't seen one. I'm not going to say I don't believe in one.
You
okay?
believe?
You know?
You believe?
Well, look, don't think you know everything, right? Who knows? Just because I haven't seen one, I'm not going to mess with anyone who's floating around, you know. See, I mean, this book, there's this idea that they sit on your shoulder and read when you're reading, because ghosts can't go get library cards, right? So every time you read a book, there's a ghost sitting on your shoulder, and if you start falling asleep, it means the guy's bored and he wants you to pick up another book. But so this idea that, and there's enough, you know, folklore and stories. So anyway, sorry, I just wanted to clarify that to the ghosts in the room that you know, I respect you all.
So you do not know whether they exist, but you are not confirmed that they do exist. So you are in between, in the middle. How is it possible to write in the voice of something which you do not absolutely 100% believe in?
No, you have to believe in the thing you write. So even if you're playing tricks on yourself, you have to act like you believe in it.
There must be a fascinating element for you to write about ghost stories.
So, okay, what was more interesting to me, and there's ghost stories in every culture, but what I found, and this has been sociologically documented, wherever there's been tragedy, there are ghost stories. So if there's a village where young men and women went missing, suddenly there are sightings or apparitions in the jungle. Tsunami villages that were wiped out, a lot of sightings of ghosts. So now whether this is because ghosts exist or whether this is something that humans use to process tragedy. But that was something, and there's a few papers written on that the ghost sightings are related to bomb sites and so on. So I was interested in that. And then this idea of, you know, people who write about, I'll go back to this example, people who write about dragons have certainly not met a dragon, but that doesn't mean you can't write a compelling 8-book saga featuring dragons. So
Obviously
I think, so I was more interested in, okay, if there were ghosts, the victims of '89, whose murders are unsolved, who don't even have graves, what would they have to say if they were interviewed? And that's why Chats with the Dead was the original title. But of course, I had to then create an afterlife and the thing is this, nobody knows, you know, you can't interview a ghost or a dead person or ask someone who's been to the afterlife what it's like. So that's an empowering thing as well, because no one can prove me wrong. Who says that the afterlife doesn't look like a visa office? Who says that there aren't spirits wandering around and demons whispering things in my ear? So I think I did, and this took many years to arrive at this vision of the afterlife. But there's plenty of literature on demons in Sri Lanka. I mean, there's There's academic paper published in the 30s cataloging all the various demons in Sri Lanka. I mean, I don't know how scientific it was, but I read that. And so I borrowed from a lot of folklore, a lot of religious
internet?
traditions.
Is it in internet, the thing that...
Yes, yes, Mr. Nandadeva, Professor Nandadeva Vijayasekara, the sub-modalities of demons in Ceylon. And it's, yeah, so there was plenty of things for me to borrow from: philosophy, religion, near-death experiences. So this idea of the light comes from a lot of victims who flatlined and they come back. They all describe seeing a light, and you know, you don't know if that is true or if it's their mind kind of shutting down or whatever. But so I can borrow from these and create it. But that's what fiction writing is about.
So Maali Almeida is a war photographer, and he is also a closeted homosexual. If you had written that novel in 1980s, do you think you would have made your main character, main protagonist, as a homosexual?
So writing novels in the 1980s, I have to make some gymnastics back there because I'm not sure it's a hard one to answer because I think this novel...
Do you think times have changed? Do you think times have changed?
Well, certainly, okay. Being a gay man in 1989, anywhere in the world, I think, is a much different experience to being LGBTQ in 2022. We didn't even have those letters in 89. And so I don't know if would have been able to write this in the 80s, because now we're looking back and social attitudes have changed and the way the media portrays this thing has changed. So it's, yeah, I think what was interesting to me was how would a gay man have lived at that period. And I spoke with many gay men from that period, friends and, you know, acquaintances, and I realized, you know, he couldn't express himself. And I don't know if he published... Shyam Selvadurei's Funny Boy came out in 1995. It was a groundbreaking novel, a gay coming-of-age story. So I don't know if I would have been brave enough to write a gay story before Shyam, you know, broke the new ground for us. So, yeah, probably not. I think things have certainly changed now, and I guess now we can talk about these things, and maybe in the 80s it would have been much more controversial if I'd written.
Lots of questions, but very little answer. I'm going to quickly scan because there are few things that we really want to know, especially about publishing. So being a South Asian writer, how difficult was it for you to find publisher in the Western market?
So it's never easy. It's never something you take for granted.
Do you think being South Asian was even more, I mean, that added to the barrier?
Well, not necessarily, because look, when I started writing in the early 2000s, you know, South Asian literature had made its mark on the world, and there were many celebrated writers from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh who had won prizes and sold in the West. So I don't know if it's a South Asian thing, but it's certainly sitting in Colombo, in Kurunegala, Sri Lanka, writing about a war or about a cricketer that no one remembered. I think that was a challenge anyway. Who would be interested in this story? So with my first book, and I didn't expect it to be published in the UK or the US, you're writing about a cricketer who played in the 80s for Sri Lanka. Very limited niche scope there. So you didn't take it for granted. I thought I'd get a publisher in India, but beyond that, you know, I was lucky to be published in the UK. But it was, I think, it was critically acclaimed. It had a loyal following, but it wasn't a huge book. I think and then I took so long to write my second that when it came out, it seemed almost all the doors that Chinaman had opened were closed. And a lot of people said, it's a difficult book. It's about a war that no one remembers, about a country that no one can... And so there is that attitude I came across a lot. I suppose it changed and so I struggled. I really had to find, and we ended up with sort of books, indie publisher, mainly non-fiction, but you know, I had a great editorial relationship with Natanya and Mark, and they really helped me get this and they said, this manuscript, it's got a great story in there, but you need to make it easier for a Western audience to relate to it. But I think that is what fiction writers should be doing. It should be, and I mentioned this in my first session, that you want to write a book that someone anywhere in the world can pick up and have an experience with. Whether they know about Sri Lankan cricket or Sri Lankan atrocities, they should be able to do that. So I think that's your duty, to write a book that can be, even though you're writing very specific things, it should be appreciated by anyone who has a love for story and interest in other parts of the world. But I think this challenge is always there. And even with my third book, I suspect I won't have as much trouble finding a publisher for the third book. But it's not something, the third book becomes a flop, I'm sure I'll be struggling again. You know, you can't take for granted. You're writing in a small, small country, small conflict, huge publishing world. So yeah, I don't know if it's a South Asian thing, but it can be overcome, I think.
So skipping my 3 questions, very, very important question. I'm going to ask him about, it might sound very, trivial, but it's also necessary for people like us. So I've noticed one thing, that you are not that active in Twitter. Why you are not active? Is it because you think it's not an ideal place for a writer to linger? Do you think it's very toxic?
No, I mean, look, don't put words in my mouth. Elon Musk might be listening, and he's worse than the ghosts. I fear him more. But I kind of explained before the idea that I craft everything. So even a status update, it takes me a while. I am certainly on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, Insta not so much, but I'm watching, and I waste too much time on it.
Watching because the publisher makes you, to be in the social media.
No. Sri Lanka's conflict in 2022, Sri Lanka's election, Twitter was the place you get the updated news. I mean, the news channels take 2 hours to report it. On Twitter, if you're following the right people, so I use it as that kind of resource. I don't talk on it because one thing, if you're writing, you need to switch the internet off. I mean, that's switch your phone off and the internet off. But also when you put a comment, we all know this, right? Then you're watching, okay, who's liking it, who's retweeting it, and then you look, and then who's commenting on it, and then should I comment back? And then 4 hours have gone and you haven't written your chapter of your novel. And I think so, generally, if you're trying to do anything creative otherwise, I think get off the social media. So that's one reason. But also, I'd rather spend 7 years and really formulate my argument rather than do a quick hot take on something and then regret it because your opinion might have changed 3 months later, but this thing is there, and so generally best to stay away from it.
And how do you balance your life between your family life as a father, as a son, as a husband, at the same time doing your day job, and then also same time winning all the prizes that is there, and at the same time keeping your humor intact?
Well, my wife and family are here. You should pass the mic to them, I think, and ask that one. Yeah, they're shaking their heads. I think, look, one thing I say, get 8 hours of sleep. I think that's the mandatory. We try and stuff so many things into our lives, and I used to do that and, get 3 hours of sleep and think you're being a superhero. Firstly, sleep is essential. But I just divide the day up. In the morning, I do my copywriting and early morning I do my writing. Mid-morning, I do my copywriting and, emails and all that. And then afternoon, hopefully I have time to spend with the family. It doesn't always work out, but you divide your day. But sleep is the key,
So my question hasn't ended, but I will have to end this session here with Shehan. But I'm opening the floor for audience. If you have any questions, lots of questions, please do ask Shehan about it regarding the book and other stuff.
Hello.
Please, can you?
Hi. Hi, Shehan.
Hi, Mona.
Thank you for that. You wrote, in addition to fiction and copywriting, you're also a children's book writer. You wrote, Please Don't Put That in Your Mouth. I love that book. Baby Baba just puts everything in his mouth, and I know you spoke a little bit about humor earlier. As someone who's been behind the scenes of sort of curating and creating children's books, I think it's one of the hardest things to write. I'm curious about your process, and it could be about that book or just about writing children's books and how do you do it and all of that in 2 minutes.
Okay. So the sequel, Where Shall I Poop, was my masterpiece, I feel. That is the book that I'm most proud of. I'm doing one on sleep, which is my new passion, and I did one, The Sneaky Plants, where plants have a secret life out when humans are asleep. I'm doing one about insects now, which I'm really raring to get into. One reason for that is, so this book took a long time, and meanwhile I had 2 kids, and which meant it would take even longer. And I remember buying books for the kids, and reading to them. And The Very Hungry Caterpillar, we all know that book, sells 1 million copies every year. Since 1967, sells 1 million copies. And I was like, why am I spending 7 years writing literary fiction that, may sell a few thousand copies and no one will read? If I can do a hungry caterpillar, then job is done. So me and my brother's a talented artist. So we said, yeah, let's try and do a children's book every year. And drawing from the experiences of my 2 children, putting stuff in their mouth, pooping all over the place, playing with bugs, and all that. So the material's always there. And we thought, okay, and now we've escalated to 2 books a year. It's hard work still. So I still put aside like a couple of months to write the thing, and then he spends about 6 months illustrating the thing, and it's our own business, so we didn't go through a mainstream publisher. So hopefully we're waiting for that hungry caterpillar, one of them to like go crazy, and then. But I think it's something we'll continue because it is a lot of fun, and when you're writing these heavy novels, it's good to have multiple projects. I feel if I have only one thing to do, I end up watching YouTube. But if I have 5 things to do, I'll maybe do the least urgent things so the children's books get done, maybe something else might get done. And so, yeah, that's the process. But, yeah, thank you for answering that question. The kids' books don't get enough, yeah.
Next.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Shehan.
Hi.
Yeah. I got 2 questions. One is, glad to know that you work for an agency as a copywriter. And I would like to know how do you toggle between the 4-word headline and 400 pages of book? So one is that. And second question is, since you work for an agency and you started your book as a chat with dad, chat with the thing. So, and you again renamed it as 7 Moons. What was that rebranding exercise you kind of initiated with?
Okay, 2 big questions. So the first one's the simplest. I think it's the same skill whether you're writing a radio spot, 30-second radio spot, or a 400-page novel. You're still using a pencil, in my case, and a A3 pad, and a laptop if you want, and your mind, and it's still the same process. Of course, the 400-page novel or the 30-page brochure is going to take longer than the simple headline. But I still think you're using your focus and all that. And I don't work in an agency. I haven't for the last 10 years. That helps because when I worked in an agency, I hardly had time to read a book, especially when I was working in Singapore. And forget writing a book. And the only way I could write was when I woke up very, very early and didn't get much sleep. So now, but thankfully, around advertising, there's a great freelance economy, which the pandemic boosted. So now I can work 2-3 hours or maybe 2-3 days a week and manage those 2 things. But I actually, people ask, are you going to give up your day job now that the bookers come? I don't know. I'd like to keep it going because I feel that somehow that escaped, like the kids' books. Working on soap powder or working on insurance, it kind of liberates me, and then I can write about these grim, gruesome bodies. And so I think they feed each other. I know some writers who work in completely unrelated fields, and that works for them, that they don't use their brain during their work and then they reserve it for after work. So I think it's up to you how you juggle it. But I think they both feed each other. It's not a distraction. It's a long story about the title change, but let's just say, I think I touched on it. Chats with the Dead was well received in India, but unwanted around the world. And so I spent 2 years rewriting it, and by the end of it, they're the same book, but I think 7 Moons has it's had 2 years work on it. So yeah, there's episodes that are taken, and it's a much more pacier, and so it felt disingenuous to use the same title. So I think we wanted to show that it was a fresh book. So that's why the title change also came in. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed listening to you. You kind of alluded to this a little bit through your questions, but I'd love to hear a bit more about what books inspired you. And a second part to that is I'd love to hear what your favorite book of 2022 was.
These are tough ones. Well, I can tell you what inspired. If you look at the acknowledgements in the book itself, the 3. Kurt Vonnegut, George Saunders, Douglas Adams, Margaret Atwood. writers who write about very grim subjects, but are very, very readable. Douglas Adams is writing about the pointlessness of existence and the meaninglessness of humanity's place in the universe. But it's a riot, it's a comedy, and Kurt Vonnegut's also writing about how civilization, humans are savage monkeys who are going to destroy the planet and themselves, but his books are a riot. And the main one was George Saunders. I read his short stories, and when Lincoln in the Bardo won the Booker in 2017, I remember being quite demoralized. I was like, oh no, a talking ghost book has won the Booker. There's no way another talking ghost book is ever going to be published. But of course, I read Lincoln in the Bardo, which is a masterpiece, and that actually inspired me more because it's a very different book to mine. But those are the writers I tend to gravitate towards who are readable, deceptively readable and entertaining, but are also talking about some grim episodes and tragedies. 2022, does it have to be a book that came out in 2022? Because if it does, I mean, I'm reading my way through the Booker short list and long list, and just finished Percival Everett, The Trees, and O. William by Elizabeth Stroud, which both of which, and I expected to like The Trees because it's my kind of crazy, but Elizabeth Stroud, I was very surprised how moved I was by that voice. So those were two that I'd mention for this year.
I think we will end this session. Shehan, thank you so much for writing The 7 Moons of Maali Almeida. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siwani. Thank you. Thank you very much.